Hey everyone, you're watching We Had That, and today I'm going to talk about a trip I took to England in 1983 where I discovered the Palitoy version of the real American hero G.I. Joe line called Action Force. In the summer of 1983, I found myself in London, England, standing in the biggest toy store I had ever seen, looking at a huge display of strange and intriguing action figures. I had already stopped to stare at two guys wearing Sectar's costumes, introducing kids to the weird new Bug Warrior toy line. I had also already seen massive sections for all kinds of new and wondrous toys that I'd never seen before. But in 1983, my focus was on G.I. Joe. The strange figures in front of me were the closest thing to G.I. Joe in the store. In fact, some of these figures were actual G.I. Joe figures who'd been painted differently than their American counterparts. According to the packages, these figures were Action Man Action Force. They were kind of like a cross between Star Wars figures and G.I. Joe. Most of them had 5 points of articulation and soft plastic, and only the G.I. Joe imposters had the G.I. Joe style of articulation. It was interesting to me that a lot of these figures had weapons that looked exactly like the ones that came with my G.I. Joe figures, but often in different colors. The G.I. Joe Mobat tank, the Ram motorcycle, the Vamp Jeep, the MMS mobile missile launcher, the Flak, and the HAL, which were the two big guns for the first wave of G.I. Joe, were all there, but painted differently. The Ram came with Scarlet, but she had a green outfit and blonde hair and was named Quarrel instead of Scarlet. It was crazy. I was allowed to buy more toys that day than I usually would have been allowed to buy in a month, but I was still very limited. So I decided to focus on the stuff that was completely different from G.I. Joe. A decision that paid off in part, but it meant that I missed out on at least one of the coolest pieces there. These are the 8 action figures and the 1 vehicle that I did pick up. I'm very glad I picked up 2 specific figures that day, Baron Ironblood and the Black Major, the 2 main bad guys in the line. Baron Ironblood was the leader of the Red Shadows, the Cobra-like enemy of Action Force. According to the story in the comics, Ironblood eventually became Cobra Commander. That way, the characters from the American G.I. Joe line could just be sold in Europe without having to reconfigure anything. The Black Major was Ironblood's second in command, who eventually went on to lead the Red Shadows. I also managed to pick up 1 or 2 figures from each of the different Action Force teams. Hawkwind, the space security trooper from the Space Force, the S.A.S. squad leader named Eagle, Z-Force members Tracker and Skip, who is the Z-Force captain, and lastly, Phones and Shark from Q-Force, the underwater team. I wish so much that I had picked up that Ram motorcycle. Back home, the Ram was one of my all-time favorite G.I. Joe vehicles, so having a different version would have been absolutely awesome. Plus, it came with a variant of Scarlet. Instead, I chose an underwater sled thing called the Stingray. I rarely involved my figures with any kind of water-based adventures, so why I chose that particular piece, I can only blame on sensory overload. It's also possible that the Ram wasn't available that day, or simply so much more expensive that it wasn't an option. I honestly don't remember. I had seen a lot. My mom had to have known that this stop wasn't going to be a quick one. You can't put a kid in any toy store and expect him to leave in 5 minutes. But when that toy store is in another country and filled with toys he's never seen before, you have to know it's going to take some time. And this wasn't just any toy store. This was Hamley's. We had Toys R Us, Lionel Playworld, FAO Schwartz, KB Toys, and dozens of Kmart, Richway, and Service merchandise stores back home, so I was used to big selections of toys. But Hamley's is probably the biggest toy store in the world. This place was huge. If memory serves, it took up an entire city block, and according to the bag that came with my figures, which I still have, the store was 6 floors tall. I don't know how long we were there, but my mom would probably tell you that it seemed like at least a month. I kept all the card backs from my Action Force figures, and fortunately, I kept them in my original Hamleys bag from 1983. I remember there were photos of the store, but I can't find them. Just Stonehenge. About a dozen identical pictures of Stonehenge. Oh, and one picture of me petting a random dog on the way back to the hotel, still holding my bag of new action figures. I made one more bad decision that day, too. The coolest of all the figures that I got was an S.A.S. squad leader. I knew right away, there was no question that he was the coolest guy. Unfortunately, his gun was lost at some point when I was a kid. Unlike in the United States, where Hasbro stopped making 12-inch G.I. Joes back in the 70s, Palitoy kept making Action Man in the 12-inch format, and they had the S.A.S. guy in the 12-inch scale too. I wanted that one, but in order to get him, I probably would have had to put back several of the 3 3/4-inch figures, or maybe the underwater vehicle that I got, maybe even both, but it would have been so worth it. I never had any 12-inch Joes until I was a teenager, and by that time, I didn't play with toys anymore. I just collected them. I already knew what a huge mistake I'd made by the time I got back to the hotel, but by then it was too late. To this day, that 12-inch S.A.S. Commander is probably at the top of my list of the one that got away action figures from my childhood. Still, it was absolutely amazing that I was allowed to get so many figures and a vehicle all at one time. This never would have happened back home. I guess it was because it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Or maybe just to keep me quiet for the rest of the trip. But whatever the reason, I was very excited to have these amazing new action figures to include in my G.I. Joe adventures. Are you familiar with the Action Force? If so, what was your introduction to the line? Was it the toys? Was it the comic books? Was there even a cartoon? Did you discover them online in recent years? Who was your favorite figure? Tell me in the comments below. And one last thing. If you collect toys, you should know about ToyLanta, the best toy show in the southeastern United States, held annually just north of Atlanta, Georgia. Visit ToyLanta.com for more information. As always, thanks for watching.